Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's panel discussion entitled Human Rights, Humanitarian and Development Nexus for Sustainable Peace in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This panel discussion is organized by the United Nations Human Rights Office in Seoul. My name is Daniel Collins, Human Rights Officer within the Seoul office. I'll be moderating this panel discussion, which will run until 5:50 p.m. local Korean time. We have 4 presentations for this session, followed by a discussant and then a question and answer session at the end. If you have questions, please follow the instructions on the website, scanning the QR code and sending your question in, and then I'll receive the questions here on stage. So without further ado, let's begin with the first presentation from the Deputy Representative of the UN Human Rights Office in Seoul, Mr. Imesh Pokarel. He'll be introducing a new discussion paper that was released this week by the Seoul office entitled Implications of the Right to Development for the DPRK and Other United Nations member states. So, Imesh, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of the United Nations office in Seoul, I would like to thank everyone for listening to this panel discussion on human rights, humanitarian and development nexus for sustainable peace in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I would like to thank the Ministry of Unification for organizing this forum. My special thanks goes to the respected panelists, Dr. Lee Kyum-sun, Professor Dr. Diane DeCetro, Ms. Siami Pubiman-na-Shinge, and Mr. Kyung-myo Kang for providing the valuable time and participating in this forum. Today, I'm here to present the OHCHR Seoul discussion paper on the implications of the right to development for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and other United Nations member states. This paper was launched last week, and it is available in OHCHR Global as well as Seoul office website. We know that economic development is a declared priority policy objective for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a priority even more challenging in the current context of COVID-19. The DPRK interest in engaging with the international community on peace, security, and denuclearization is also linked with its interest in pursuing economic development. This paper tries to analyze the goal of economic development through the prism of the United Nations declarations on the right to development. In doing so, it aims to unpack some of the human rights obligations the right to development holds for the primary duty bearer, the DPRK state in this case, which move beyond narrow definitions of the economic development. The paper also considers the implications the right to development has for other United Nations member states engaging with the DPRK. Development is not a narrow concept concerned with only economic growth. The 1986 United Nations Declarations on the Right to Development is the perfect demonstration of this, involving the whole spectrum of the human rights, not just economic rights, but also civil, political, social, and cultural rights. Development is defined by the declaration as a comprehensive economic, social, cultural, and political process. It aims at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population on the basis of the active, free, and meaningful participation. What are the obligations of the DPRK state as a primary duty bearer under the international human rights law? Under the right to development, the state assumes obligations towards all individuals and peoples at the 3 broad levels: internally through the formulation of the national development policies and programs, internationally including through the state's foreign policy, and collectively through global and regional partnership. Central to the right to development is the realization of the right to adequate standard of living. This includes equality of opportunity for all in their access to basic resources, education, health services, food, housing, employment, and their fair distribution of income. The DPRK has translated this aspiration into legally binding obligation through its ratification of some of the core United Nations human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as references to upholding human rights in their own constitution. Under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the state has an obligation to take steps to the maximum of the available resources with the view to achieving progressively the full realization of the rights recognized in the ESE Covenant. The Committee on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has also clarified that a minimum core obligations to ensure the satisfaction of, at the very least, minimum essential levels of each of the rights is incumbent upon every state party. Thus, a state party in which any significant number of individuals are deprived of essential foodstuffs, of essential primary care, of basic shelter and housing, or of the most basic forms of education is prima facie failing to discharge its obligations under the covenant. What the right to development helps to shed light on when it comes to the state obligations to realize the right to adequate standard of living is the interconnectedness and interrelatedness of the whole spectrum of state obligations under international human rights law, including the civil and political rights. State must take steps to eliminate obstacles to development resulting from failure to absorb civil and political rights as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. Pertinent interlinkages include the role of civil and political rights as a means of ensuring the realization of the right to an adequate standard of living, including the right to food. For example, a free media that increases public awareness and informs public debate, an elected legislator which members represent the views and concerns of their constituents, a civic space where people are free to express themselves and to organize peacefully, these can ensure the alarm is raised over impeding problems such as food shortages and thereby inform the state's distribution of resources to realize economic, social, and cultural rights. Furthermore, other civil and political rights such as access to independent judiciary and the rule of law help to ensure that the human rights obligations committed to at the international level, including the right to adequate standard of living, are protected and properly implemented at the national level. These include judicial review of the state policies that violate the right to an adequate standard of living. Another strength of the Declaration of the Right to Development is that it sheds light on the obligations of the international community to ensure the realization of these rights. The Declaration on the Right to Development highlights that states have the duty to cooperate for the establishment of an international order through which the right to development can be fully achieved. And that would include provision of aid. The provision of aid and development cooperation has been one of the means by which the international community has been supporting the realization of the right to development for all in other countries. Commitment by the states to provide aid to support development has been laid out in the Sustainable Development Goals and in other international agreements on financing for development. However, the right to development helps to highlight that the provision of aid is not just a transfer of resources from the rich to the poor countries through overseas development aid. It also requires states to be proactive in securing fairer trading rules, promoting productive capacities in developing countries, and tackling debt bondages alongside promoting good governance at the national level. In the context of the DPRK, humanitarian agencies have struggled over a number of years to raise sufficient funds to finance their operations. In 2020, only 28% of the UN interagency appeal was funded. The difficulty in raising funds is partly explained by the DPRK's government access restriction placed on the humanitarian actors. The current prolonged COVID-19 travel restrictions and the departure of the international humanitarian agencies have also made these challenges all more acute. Moving beyond humanitarian assistance. The right to development helps to highlight the obligation of states to move beyond a humanitarian approach and towards a development approach that addresses underlying vulnerabilities and causes of situation in which people's human rights are denied. This requires the primary state concerned, in this case the DPRK, to introduce long-term and profound reforms aimed towards inclusive, equitable, and sustainable development. The right to development also encourages other states to move beyond a humanitarian approach to overseas assistance, which tends to only address the immediate needs and symptoms of the situations, such as food insecurity, and encourages states to move towards a development approach that addresses underlying vulnerabilities and root causes. In the context of the DPRK, this includes considering the role that sanctions may play in helping or hindering development actors, including within the United Nations systems, to move beyond humanitarian assistance in country and towards development programs focused on improving the capacities of the state to fulfill the right to development. Member states will also need to evaluate the commitment of their state targeted by sanctions to direct resources to fulfilling the right to development and away from areas that threaten peace and security. The sanctions. The Declaration on the Right to Development emphasizes on the duty of the states to cooperate for the establishment of an international order through which the right to development can be fully realized, and also has implication for the pursuit of other objectives such as the maintenance and restoration of international peace and security. The DPRK is subject to a combination of unilateral and multilateral United Nations sanctions that place restrictions on DPRK-related trade, investment, and financial transactions. The UN sanctions has been in place since 2006 as a measure enacted under the Charter, UN Charter, to maintain international peace and security. However, in pursuing enforcement measures, member states also need to take into account their international human rights obligations. The OHCHR committee has highlighted that member states continue to have human rights obligations under international human rights law when implementing sanctions. The committee also has clarified that the people's right must be taken into full account while designing an appropriate sanctions regime. This includes establishing effective monitoring throughout the period sanctions are enforced, provide necessary exemptions to goods and services, more precisely targeting of the vulnerabilities of those whose behavior the international community wishes to change, and taking steps to respond to any disproportionate suffering experienced by vulnerable groups within the targeted community. The state targeted with sanctions also has the obligations to facilitate access to United Nations monitors and provide adequate and credible data and other evidences to enable an accurate analysis on the impact on human rights and humanitarian situation. Trade and investment relations. In future, progress towards denuclearization and subsequent normalization of the relations could lead to the easing of sanctions, enabling states to develop trade and investment relations with the DPRK. The right to development, the declarations helps to highlight that such trade and investment relations with the DPRK need to serve the interest of the people. The states have obligations to ensure that trade investment relations help realize a form of development in which the human person is the central subject and its active participant and beneficiary. At the very least, trade and investment agreements should not violate a state's own international human rights obligation, including in relations to the treatment of the workers and the fair remuneration. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights also have human rights assessments of trade and investment agreements, provides the tools for states to ensure that they fulfill the obligation. Disarmament. The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is a priority of the international community to ensure sustainable peace and security. What the Declaration on the Right to Development contributes is the broadening of the horizon, highlighting the interconnectedness of the peace and security, development, and human rights, and the role of all member states in this regard. Article 7 of the Declaration affirms that all states should promote the establishment, maintenance, and strengthening of the international peace and security, and to that end should do the utmost to achieve general and complete disarmament under effective international control, as well as to ensure that the Resources released by effective disarmament measures are used for comprehensive development, in particular that of the developing countries. In the context of the DPRK, this highlights the importance of the DPRK rebalancing defense expenditure to ensure adequate resources are directed to the welfare of the people. It also highlights the part played by the other state in this equation and their role in creating an environment where the DPRK feels secure to commit to such relocation of the resources. I'd like to conclude. We have witnessed that discussions involving the DPRKs tend to take place in silo, with peace and security, development, and human rights all traveling on the separate tracks. This discussion paper seeks to provoke thought on how the right to development offers a means of broadening such concept and bringing these disparate tracks together, highlighting the interlinkages between the violation of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Through this paper, OHCHR expects to have further dialogue and discussions on how the right to development framework can help guide the DPRK as a primary duty bearer to instigate reforms to its institutional, legal, and policy frameworks to realize the right to development. The paper also aims to encourage further dialogue and discussions on how the right to development framework can shape and inform other states' engagement with the DPRK in their pursuit for a more peaceful and secure Korean peninsula in which the rights of all people are fulfilled. We have in this panel distinguished experts who will be exploring further on the linkages between human rights development and humanitarian nexus. I look forward to hearing from all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Imesh, for the opening presentation. The paper is now available publicly, on which the presentation was based. Both the English language and Korean language versions of the discussion paper can be found on OHCHR's DPRK homepage, if you want to take a look at the paper itself. So next we'll hear from Ms. Shami Puvimanasinghe, who's Human Rights Officer at the UN Human Rights Office, working out of Geneva HQ in the Right to Development section. She's also Secretary of the Human Rights Council's Social Forum. Her presentation is entitled Exploring the Interface of Peace, Human Rights and Development, and she'll touch on issues including environmental considerations and the context of development in a post-COVID-19 world. So, Shami, over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone present. Thank you so much to the organizers and our fellow OHCHR colleagues in the Seoul office for organizing this. We at headquarters, and in particular the Right to Development section, are pleased to see this publication launched and hope, like Imesh said, that it will be the start of a dialogue based on the right to development and all human rights, because the right to development brings in the whole human rights framework. So on the interface of peace, human rights, and development, as has been already mentioned, all of these three interconnected pillars of the UN Charter and the whole UN system, the pillars and foundations on which the UN was built, meet in this human right to development. The interconnections, many times it has been said, including by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, that there can be no peace without development, no development without peace, and no lasting peace or sustainable development without respect for human rights and the rule of law. This has been said by many UN leaders, including the current leader. how do we see, what is the connection, if we look at it a little further? What are the root causes of conflict? Well, that depends, because different societies, different places in the world have seen conflicts arise from different causes. But oftentimes we see causes like poverty, extreme inequality, the absence of, or the denial or the neglect of human rights, whether they be civil and political or economic, social and cultural. So human rights and the right to development are a means to prevent conflict and to sustain peace by preventing the root causes or rooting out those causes of conflict, poverty, inequality, discrimination, etc. All human rights belong to all people, stemming from Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that all people are born free in dignity and rights and owe to each other, because they all are endowed with reason and conscience. They owe to each other that respect and dignity, and need to behave and treat each other with solidarity, brotherhood, sisterhood. And if that was really, if we saw the realization of the rights in the Universal Declaration as well as the whole human rights framework, we would see a more peaceful world. We are now living in a very interdependent and globalized world. The pandemic, COVID-19, has highlighted this more than ever before. And looming against, in the backdrop, is environmental issues, climate change, which affects all countries, including, I've seen, the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Environmental problems, environmental disasters, natural disasters, man-made disasters, all of these can be redressed to some extent, or at least addressed to minimize the damage, to avert the harm rather than have harm and then try to redress it later through the human rights framework. We live in a globalized world, and this interdependence is now seen also in the issue of international inequalities, the lack of access to vaccines, particularly in the poorer countries of the world. So more than ever before, I think it's time to recognize these interlinkages, this interdependence, and act as an international community led by the United Nations. Sustainable development, it brings together economic, social, environmental issues, so that development can no longer be said, as was just explained in the 1986 declaration. Already we saw a very interconnected definition of development. Development being defined as the improvement of human well-being, and read in a dynamic and evolving manner, we can also say the well-being of the planet and all its people. The COVID-19 has led to health crisis as well as many other crises, socio-economic and financial crisis, debt crisis on every front. And to solve these, it becomes so important to ramp up on international cooperation and solidarity. And the right to development is built on the foundations and the edifice of international solidarity and cooperation. So today we talk about building back better, or building forward, building better together for recovery, resilience, and preparedness, as no one is safe until everyone is safe, and that we are only as strong as our weakest link. To say a few more words about the Declaration on the Right to Development itself, it makes development a human right. It is both individual and collective. So I enjoy my rights, but also with the rest of the community. And there is this relationship between me and the community. Likewise, the national and international dimensions. A country cannot realize all human rights on its own. There has to be this international dimension and global partnership. Going on to 2030 agenda, we talk about global partnership and means of implementation. The central entitlements of the right to development is that it entitles everyone to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy development in its economic, social, cultural, and political dimensions. So this very holistic and multidimensional approach of the right to development, and every person, every human being is entitled to participate, to contribute, and to enjoy the fruits of development. Some of its principles and elements, the RTD has many principles and elements, but people-centered development. So the human person is at the center of development. It's a central subject, participant, and beneficiary. The human rights-based approach is that development should be carried out in a manner in which all human rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural, and as well as solidarity rights. We now see the right to development, the right to peace, the right to environment. So in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. Active, free, and meaningful participation of all individuals and peoples, fair distribution of the benefits. So all human rights, we know, have at the basic principles equality, non-discrimination, participation, accountability, transparency. And these, as the right to development is a human right, equally all of these basic principles lie also at the heart of the right to development. But it has some additional principles and elements because it looks not only at the national, but also at the international dimension. So like all other human rights, there should be no distinction as to race, sex, language, religion, etc. But it also has the right of peoples to self-determination, including full sovereignty over all their natural wealth and resources. States have a duty to cooperate to create an enabling local and global environment for development and to eliminate obstacles to development. So even violation of human rights are a form of obstacles to development. Unfair trade rules in the global arena or investment rules could be considered obstacles to development. Socio-economic justice is at the heart of the right to development. The RTD requires appropriate national and international development policies. So we talk now a lot about macroeconomic policies. Well, RTD is all about macroeconomic policies because what it says is that those policies at all levels, national, local, international, should be aimed at human well-being. Peace, security, disarmament, a critical aspect of the right to development in Article 7, which says that countries should cooperate for disarmament and that the money that is saved from that disarmament should be used for development, for comprehensive development, especially of the developing countries. And development itself is described or defined as a comprehensive economic, social, cultural, and political process which aims at the constant improvement of all well-being. Who is entitled to the right to development? Everybody, all individuals, all peoples, and the entire population. And human rights, as we know, have a particular focus on those who are weak, who are vulnerable, who are poor, who are marginalized, who are discriminated, who are excluded. So the right to development is no different, while of course it belongs to all people. And an important dimension also of the right to development is the duties. The duties under the right to development apply at 3 levels. So like all other human rights, internally, through national policies and programs. So a government owes the right to development to all its people, but also internationally through policies extending beyond their jurisdictions. In other words, extraterritorial dimensions. So if country A adopts some policies which then harm country B, that also goes against the right to development. And then the third level is collectively through global and regional partnerships. So international organizations, for instance, member states acting collectively through regional and global organizations have a duty to uphold the right to development. The international community and even all human beings. The right to development is very broad, as you can see. Even all human beings do have, and all those whose actions and omissions have an impact on human rights and on the environment in which these rights are fulfilled. A few words about sustainable development. This goes back to the 1987 World Commission report, defined it as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So here comes still another dimension, the dimension of present and future generations, and the need to also fulfill the needs not only of the present, but of those yet to come. The youth, children, as well as people yet unborn. So inter and intragenerational equity is also central to sustainable development. And there is a very close link between the right to development and sustainable development. For example, in Principle 3 of the Vienna Declaration on and Program of Action, as well as the Rio Declaration of 1992, said the right to development should be fulfilled so as to meet equitably the developmental and environmental needs of present and future generations. As you know, there are 17 SDGs and 169 targets and so many indicators. And the right to development and all human rights are critical to realization of all of the SDGs. Because the right to development, for example, makes development not a charity, not a generosity, but a right. It is the inalienable, universal right of every human being. And therefore, development has to, and countries which do development, international organizations, and particularly through policies, have to meet those human rights. So trade, investment, finance, aid, debt, technology, intellectual property, and all these global arrangements must then create an enabling environment for development, for peace, for human rights, for all of these. The 2030 Agenda is informed by the Declaration and recognizes respect for human rights. The RTD requires good governance, equality of opportunity for all in their access to basic resources and services, fair distribution of income, an active role for women. Gender equality and women's empowerment is also important, especially in the 2030 Agenda, but is also recognized in the right to development. International cooperation, solidarity, and friendly relations are essential to realizing the RTD. The RTD is particularly relevant to SDG 17, which is about global partnership and the means of implementation. To realize the SDGs, and particularly in the COVID-19 context, when countries are becoming more and more struck by financial crisis, by debt crisis, it is imperative to strengthen this global partnership. And this global partnership should also be underscored by the right to development and all human rights. As you know, the 2030 Agenda has this central aim to leave no one behind. Leave no one behind and reach the furthest behind first. And it applies to all nationals and peoples and for all segments of society. And you could add, leave no country behind, because also the 2030 Agenda recognizes the weakness and vulnerability of certain countries, including African countries, landlocked countries, small island developing states, least developed countries, and as well as the poor, vulnerable, marginalized, and disadvantaged communities in all countries. The 2030 Agenda is grounded and anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all. So truly speaking, even in this, particularly in this new era of sustainable development, it doesn't seem to be possible to realize development without the other dimensions, that is human rights, peace, as well as environmental considerations. And critically, the need to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies that provide equal access to justice and that are based on respect for human rights, including the right to development. SDG 16, also very important because it looks at the governance aspects, but all SDGs. I don't think we can pick and choose all of the SDGs because they're all interconnected. And the targets and the ABC targets, you see that each SDG is followed by targets 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. But there's also ABC targets. And these ABC targets are the ones that relate to the means of implementation. So without the means of implementation being realized, it is difficult to realize the SDGs. So trade, finance, technology, all of these are part of the means of implementation, debt relief, etc. Also of importance to the development policy framework, apart from the 2030 Agenda and SDGs, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on financing for development. Finance is key, particularly now in this crisis in which we find ourselves as a humanity. Paris Agreement on climate change, the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction, and all of these together make up the current policy framework, which all of them include the right to development. And policy space and policy coherence should also be mentioned because sometimes countries, especially poor countries, developing countries, lack policy space. And this is very important. For instance, to deliver on the vaccines, they need fiscal space, policy space, to have their priorities based on human rights and the right to development. Policy coherence, trade rules, for instance, should not be conflicting with human rights obligations. We should aim for synergy, and all countries have committed to these human rights, to many human rights obligations, treaties, and these are to be taken seriously. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yami, for bringing out some of the different elements of the right to development, both at the national level in terms of the duty bearer being the state and the obligations to respect the whole spectrum of human rights, the obligation also to engage with the international community when means are limited to fulfill that obligation at home, and also the obligation of other states within the international community to create a conducive environment where the right to development can be attained. So thank you for bringing out those different elements. Our next presentation is from Mr. Kyungmo Kang, research fellow at the Notre Dame Law School in the US. He'll be concentrating on one of the core elements of the right to development, which is the right to food, and highlighting the DPRK state as the primary duty bearer in relation to this. In doing this, he'll be examining the interconnectedness and interrelatedness of the whole spectrum of rights, which the DPRK has obligations to uphold. So, Kyungmo, over to you. Thank you very much.
I'm Kyung-Mo Kang. I appreciate for this opportunity to speak about the North Korean human rights issues. I'll talk about a little more fundamental issues, the food crisis in North Korea. It's old issue, but it's still ongoing problem. The food crisis is a good topic to learn the attitude of North Korean government on human rights. So I'll briefly lay out their unique political background and the policy of agriculture and why the food crisis has not resolved for 30 years. As we all know, North Korea has suffered from food shortages for 30 years. During the food crisis in mid-1990s, the food crisis impacted North Korea in a severe way. They lost about 300 million lives because of the hunger. Personally, I was shocked to hear the news that people ate human flesh due to the lack of food. It shocked international community too. So, huge amount of food and monetary aid has flowed to the North Korea. Despite the international aid, the food crisis has still hit North Korea for decades. When the food crisis happened and international community became aware of it, it was considered to happen because of the massive flooding and drought. They could be part of the reason in 1990s, but it is not direct cause. For the last 30 years, we have observed the four crises in North Korea, and also we have seen the development of nuclear bombs and long-range ballistic missiles. Their nuclear program has been progressed even under the severe UN sanctions. I could say that the natural disasters are not the main or direct causes of the food crisis in North Korea. The most critical factors are agricultural policy and their irresponsibility and lack of sincerity over the food issues. As the matter of law, North Korea has a treaty obligation to realize the right to food under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. First, they have to use maximum available resources to secure the sufficient food to their people. A state may or should obtain food from international assistance or cooperation. Second, discrimination. I think a discrimination issue is the most important requirement in North Korean situation. The North Korean government must realize the right to food for its people without any discrimination. The state should not select particular group of people to provide food or starve. In particular, the state is required to take urgent and immediate action if people suffer from hunger. They don't have to wait some time to see the policy effect. The state has to bring the food and feed their people. Unfortunately, the North Korean government has not satisfied any of the requirements. North Korea has a unique leadership system which makes their supreme leader divine one. So in North Korea, supreme leaders' words are seen as having absolute authority even above their constitution. It cannot be politically or morally challenged by anyone in North Korea. That's why North Korean diplomats are very paranoid when the responsibility or criminal liability of supreme leader is discussed on United Nations. Policies created by their supreme leader are hardly changed, and his dignity is the most important objective to protect. Social classification, so-called songbun, is the critical component for North Korean social system. The social status is inherited from their parents according to their ancestors' status or contribution to independent movement against Japan or Korean War. And for sure, the most important factor is the loyalty to their regime. The reason why songbun is important is that the public distribution system is highly related to the songbun. All the resources are distributed by the residents and occupations which are decided by songbun. Public distribution system is the only channel to receive the food for North Koreans. So North Korean government has been able to successfully control people with the food distribution system. Then what are the causes of the food crisis? First of all, North Korea failed their agriculture by wrong choice. Geographically, only 14% of the North Korea is arable. I guess that was the reason why the first supreme leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, made policy to overuse chemical fertilizers. But it eroded the quality of soil, it reduced the food production, and North Korean government chose to deforest, expand the arable land. But North Korea disregarded that the most annual precipitation falls in summer in Korean Peninsula. So deforestation for arable land triggered a natural disaster. It led to the food shortage. Therefore, I could say that natural disasters in the 1990s are a human error. Most of the North Korean food production is done through cooperative farms. But unlike the collective farming system in Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, North Korean government allows very limited land to be cultivated privately. Farmers are not motivated at all. So it did not boost the food production. Actually, it reduced the food production. Therefore, North Korea faced a food shortage even before 1990s. We may compare the North Korean cooperative farm system to Chinese land reform that actually increased the food production by 1.3 times. Things would have changed a lot if North Korea reformed their cooperative farm system. Despite its obligation to utilize maximum available resources, North Korea has spent much of its budget on military spending, including nuclear program. It is critical reason why North Korea has still been in hunger. While their people have suffered from hunger, their government has spent a huge amount of budget to the military, even though they have been imposed severe sanctions by United Nations. Last year, North Korea government spent $667 million for nuclear weapons. I think it's more than enough to feed entire North Korean population. It strongly indicates that the North Korean government prioritized the region's security over human rights, I think. As for the discriminatory nature of the public distribution system, the problem of the PDS, the public distribution system, is that the North Korean government easily neglects a particular group of people who are low social class residing in northeastern areas. In fact, northeast region, which is vulnerable to food distribution, is almost the same as the region where children are vulnerable to nutritional conditions. So we can say that the North Korea's discriminatory food distribution system causes severe hunger for particular social classes. Lastly, the interferences with international assistance also prevented resolution of food crisis. Under the circumstances that North Korea is very unlikely to make fundamental changes in their policies, the only feasible means to alleviate the food shortage is the humanitarian food aid. But North Korea has not cooperated with international assistance by diverging food aid to selected people such as residents in Pyongyang, or misuse the food for military purposes. So there is no guarantee that the food from international community would be delivered to the vulnerable people. The humanitarian staff are not allowed to access to certain area like the northeastern provinces to monitor the food distribution. Moreover, the North Korean government provides a false information about the hunger situation. And even more serious problem is that the North Korean government took the food from international community and distributed the food through their public distribution system. It makes not only international assistance ineffective, but also prevent the North Korea from reforming their policy. So international humanitarian aid cannot be effective as long as the transparency and monitoring mechanisms are not guaranteed. As a conclusion, once again, I would like to emphasize the human error the North Korean government made lead to the food crisis. Unfortunately, we have seen that people in North Korea have still been in hunger, but North Korean government has not changed for the last 30 years. Even they became to possess nuclear bombs. It forced the international community. At this point, humanitarian aid should be the last option to feed the people in North Korea, but there must be some conditions to be met. First, humanitarian aid should be distributed, set apart from the public distribution system. Second, international community should access to the vulnerable areas to collect reliable data. And lastly, international community should encourage the North Korean government to change failed policy that at least they have to remove discriminatory nature of the food distribution system. In the end, North Korean authorities are responsible for resolving their food crisis. It may be radical, but I would say that without fundamental changes, it will be difficult to make significant progress in solving human rights and humanitarian crises, such as a food right to food. I'll finish up here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kyung-mo, for that critical analysis of the DPRK state and its shortcomings in fulfilling its own human rights obligations to the people in relation to the right to development, and particularly the right of the people to food. So moving on to the final presentation from Professor Diane Desierto. She's Professor of Law and Global Affairs and the LLM Faculty Director at the Notre Dame Law School in the US. She's also a member of the expert group of the UN Working Group on the Right to Development. Entitled Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in DPRK Sanctions, her presentation will look into the sanctions regime, the situation of economic, social and cultural rights as outlined in the UN Secretary General's latest report, and some of the tensions the sanction regime brings in terms of member states' international human rights obligations and how these tensions may be resolved. So, Professor Desierto, over to you.
Thank you very much, in particular as well to the Korea Global Forum for Peace organizers and the Ministry for its invitation, as well as for the opportunity to discuss with colleagues from the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as Mr. Kyung-mo Kang in regard to the situation regarding the DPRK's interface between peace, security, and human rights. This presentation focuses on more specifically on the nature of DPRK sanctions and how economic, social, and cultural rights are imperiled, especially in the present context of the COVID pandemic, and what could be done to evolve DPRK sanctions, or at least the nature in which the sanctions are monitored, evaluated, and assessed. So for the remaining time, for the time allocated to me, I would rather discuss in general the main Security Council resolutions that impose the sanctions on the DPRK. I will also discuss the recent July 2021 report on the human rights situation in the DPRK, noting its economic, social, cultural rights assessments by the Secretary General. And finally, explore how the UN Security Council and human rights interact and why the Security Council also has a predominant role in the fulfillment of this pillar, even in discharging its mandate with respect to international peace and security, that may cause a reevaluation of how we implement sanctions and conceptualize and monitor them in a manner that should also be cognizant of economic, social, cultural rights. The main resolutions for the security issued by the Security Council against the DPRK date back to 15 years ago with Resolution 1718, which established the Sanctions Committee, implemented a comprehensive arms embargo, froze assets and other financial resources, and exempted certain financial assets at that time that were necessary for basic expenses and foodstuffs. That has since evolved because thereafter a panel of experts was established to assist the Sanctions Committee, and expanded measures were implemented over time, also in relation to the conduct of the DPRK's government in threatening international peace and security by reason of its nuclear testing activities. So thus, in the years that followed, the measures that were implemented gradually expanded to virtually all areas of the DPRK economy, from the right of all member states to seize and destroy material that's suspected of being connected to the DPRK's research and weapons development, targeted financial sanctions, prohibitions on trade in luxury goods, cargo inspections and maritime procedures, including permitting the seizure of any vessels that are deemed to be in prohibition of the sanctions, financial measures that are so expansive in scope as to include asset freezes, and sectoral sanctions that also ban the trade in coal, minerals, and other natural resources and prohibit their procurement or transfer. Caps on the amount of coal or exports and monitoring of copper, nickel, silver, and zinc exports, prohibiting the operation of financial institutions and banks, as well as prohibiting public and private financial institutions to trade with the DPRK. Full bans on the trade and flow of commodities subject to sectoral sanctions, banning and hiring the paying of additional DPRK workers that are used to generate foreign export earnings, prohibiting new or expanded joint ventures and cooperative commercial entities with the DPRK, among others. Full ban on the supply or sale of natural gas liquids, crude oil, textile export, providing work authorizations for DPRK nationals, among others. And recently in 2017, sectoral sanctions that banned DPRK's export of food and agricultural products, machinery, electrical equipment, wooden vessels, selling or transferring fishing rights, industrial machinery, transportation vehicles, providing work authorization for DPRK nationals. It is as comprehensive a set of sanctions that are virtually incomparable to any of the other sanctions regimes that we have seen throughout the world. And the main justification, understandably, probably from the security standpoint, is because the absolutist government of North Korea has not stopped or desisted in its nuclear ambition and threatening international peace and security. But the overriding and comprehensive sanctions have also had a corresponding effect in reinforcing the deterioration of economic, social, cultural rights in the DPRK. And I say that not as a causal matter, but rather as a matter of exacerbating an already vulnerable situation that is inflicted by the North Korean government on its people. This is why the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently released the report saying that given the ongoing COVID-19 situation, it has become more challenging to gather reliable data, but they do record accounts of women and men who have left the DPRK, and those who were interviewed had given repeated testimony and accounts of recurring patterns of human rights violations and deterioration of the overall economy. They also noted that the ongoing closure of borders and increased restrictions on freedom of movement within the country have further exacerbated the human rights situation, especially on the right to food, as Mr. Kyung Mong Kang has discussed earlier. The impact of the restrictions already aggravated and exacerbated existing human rights concerns that does and made it more difficult as well with respect to freedom of access, decreased reliance on forced labor, protecting the right to freedom of movement, among others. And humanitarian assistance, while it's critical, is also pointed out as it should be consistent with obligations of North Korea in respect to the right to development, which has the primary obligation to address the underlying vulnerabilities and causes of the situations in which the people's human rights are denied. And so there was a call, at least in this report, for wider policy reform, for inclusive, equitable, sustainable development, and also an engagement and cooperation with the United Nations agencies in regard to fulfilling these economic, social, cultural rights. What are some of the primary economic, social, cultural rights that have been endangered even before the COVID-19 restrictions and were exacerbated? In the report, they referred to food insecurity and the urgent need of food assistance, the difficulty of importing food and essential agricultural inputs due to the border closures, the difficulty of accessing seed, fertilizer, agricultural chemicals, among others. The report also showed that there is a heightened risk of starvation and that it was urging the government of North Korea to invest the necessary resources to overcome food insecurity and break the cycle of isolation. Moreover, because essential humanitarian supplies have remained stranded outside the country, field visits have not been permitted, and the situation has become more dire for vulnerable populations, there is already an estimate from the UN Secretary General that 10.6 million people in North Korea will need that access to humanitarian assistance this year, especially children under the age of 5, pregnant and lactating women. The challenge is also that the health infrastructure and the capacity of their healthcare workers and doctors remain weak. There's a critical shortage of essential medical supplies, the absence of vital equipment and adequately trained staff. In the survey of capacities with respect to global health security, North Korea ranks 193 among the lowest out of 195 countries, evaluated as one of the most vulnerable countries to the ongoing pandemic, especially given the nature of its own inherently weak health infrastructure system. That being said, therefore, how do we examine and evaluate the Security Council sanctions that have been there in place for over 15 years and evaluate that in relation to economic, social, cultural rights implementation as primarily the duty of the DPRK? One must recall that the Security Council, which is also bound by the Charter of the United Nations, shares the same duty of the United Nations under Article 55 to promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction. All member states of the United Nations likewise pledge to take joint as well as separate action to cooperate with the United Nations to achieve this precise purpose. The Security Council is not exempt from that obligation. If we recall many of the famous Security Council resolutions on human rights, the Security Council has repeatedly integrated human rights law in its research, or rather in its resolutions. This included the expansion of the African Union missions in Darfur, the establishment of commissions on inquiry to investigate violations of human rights law, calling on South Africa to take measures to eliminate the policy of apartheid back in 1980, calling on international humanitarian law and human rights in the situation of the territory of the former Yugoslavia, where they explicitly condemned the ongoing human rights violations, and even most recently in the humanitarian situation facing the Syrian Arab Republic, calling on all states to comply with their human rights obligations. And back in 1968, when they established a committee to monitor sanctions against Southern Rhodesia, there was a reference to the need to ensure human rights at the time that monitoring mandate was imposed with respect to sanctions that were being imposed against Southern Rhodesia. That said, therefore, one has to look at the ongoing crisis in the DPRK as a simultaneous crisis, one of the worst underreported but serious crises in the world with respect to economic, social, and cultural rights. It is an ongoing crisis of the violation of the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, which was already in jeopardy because of pre-existing weak health infrastructure that is even now facing the brunt of the burdens of the global pandemic. There is food insecurity and starvation that is further endangered by the stranded humanitarian assistance and supplies and the vastly reduced opportunities for trade with other countries. There is a violation of the right to an adequate standard of living that is perpetually in jeopardy with a state-controlled public distribution system and the ongoing civil and political rights abuses being committed against individuals in North Korea. And finally, there are further endangerments to the rights to just and favorable conditions of work that are already being violated in forced labor contexts and also further jeopardized with pandemic stresses. Under this situation, can sanctions evolve to take into account the rights of the civilian population of North Korea? One has to remember that the Security Council, having integrated human rights law into its work, has done so in 3 ways. It has integrated human rights law in particular with respect to the mandates of its peace missions. Even in designing its field offices, it has included human rights as part of the monitoring mandates of these missions. It has set up justice and accountability mechanisms for serious human rights violations, which it did so in specialized international criminal tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, as well as in supporting national and hybrid mechanisms that seek to provide remedies and redress for human rights violations. And it has also begun to integrate the use of human rights data even in its own work. The main point here is in looking to see whether sanctions can evolve to take into account the economic, social, cultural rights of the civilian population. There must be a necessary dialogue between the 1718 Sanctions Committee, the panel of experts, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, civil society, and other constituencies who report on the ongoing economic, social, cultural rights crises being faced by increasing vulnerabilities of the civilian population. There is a further need to use human rights data to inform the work of the Security Council when it reviews these sanctions, not only from the prism of the security considerations and fears born out of nuclear ambitions by the North Korean government. And it is also equally important to dialogue to create the humanitarian corridors that can safeguard, especially at this time of heightened vulnerability, the economic, social, cultural rights of the DPRK civilian population, which is not being met by its own government. The rights to food, health, education, just and favorable conditions of work, housing, water, and an adequate standard of living, all of which are in crisis, especially during this global pandemic and the virtual lack of access to any vaccines or essential medical supplies in North Korea. I will stop here and welcome further questions with the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much, Professor Desierto, particularly for helping to bring out the difficult issue of having a sanctions regime in place under the UN Charter with the objective of maintaining peace and security, but at the same time member states having human rights obligations, including under the same UN Charter, and how those can be reconciled. Obviously, the challenge of how to get information from the DPRK to the Sanctions Committee to enable them to tailor the sanctions in a way that doesn't violate member states' human rights obligations is a challenge in itself, which perhaps we can discuss a bit later if we have time. In the meantime, as a discussant for this panel, to bring out some of the themes and offer her own thoughts prior to our question and answer session, we have with us Dr. Gum-soon Lee, Senior Research Fellow at the Korean Institute for National Unification and former head of the North Korean Human Rights Record Center at the Ministry of Unification. Dr. Lee, we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this panel discussions organized by UN OHCHR. From 1996, I have been involved in the publication of the white paper for North Korea at the Korea Institute for National Unification. And I investigated the human rights violation issues in North Korea. And the human rights white paper on North Korea published by our institution, it was often cited by the United Nations, and therefore we really try to provide a reliable data and also tried to publish a very fair white paper. While listening to the 4 presentations, my impression is that, yes, we all know that North Korea is having a serious human rights violation. And in order to address the situation, what actions can we take, especially for the lives of the general public in North Korea? You see that the North Korean state government, that's the primary duty bearer, and what kind of requests we have to make to the North Korean government, and how international community can cooperate together to induce North Korea to be more responsible for human rights protection. And in this sense, I think that this session actually provides a lot of food for thought. And regarding the 4 presentations, I'm not going to ask some specific questions or comment. Rather, because I didn't really receive the papers of the 4 presenters in advance, and so I wasn't really prepared, so I will just share my thoughts. So when it comes to the human rights, development, and peace, and here we are talking about the nexus among the 3. And recently, you see that we have discussed this issue in many conferences and gatherings. So these are very important by principle, but when it comes to the actual measures to realize these different conflicting goals, I think we have a long way to go. And in this sense, I would like to pose a question to all of you. This is something that I contemplate as well. That my question is, what is the real threat of peace on the Korean Peninsula? What poses a threat to peace on the Korean Peninsula? Of course, depending on how we define the concept of peace, answers could be different. And also the peace, it involves various elements, and therefore we cannot point out the single factor that threatens the peace on the Korean Peninsula. And I think that there are also a lot of divisive views on what's the most determining factor that poses a threat to the peace on the Korean Peninsula. And centering around the United Nations, yes, a lot of international community has expressed their concerns on the systematic and serious human rights violation in North Korea. And also in 2014, the COI, the UN agency, claimed that the human rights violation in North Korea is a threat against the peace, and they define it as the crime against humanity. Dr. Kang talked about the right to food, and according to COI's report, the food shortage and crisis constitutes a crime against humanity. And as you may be well aware, and as mentioned by the professor, the previous presenter, so he talked about the various sanctions of the United Nations. But as for the bilateral sanction imposed by the United States, they actually include the names of the North Korean leaders in the list of sanctions. And what North Korea constantly claims through the 3 rounds of UPR is that they actually refuse the submission of or the accepting of the COI resolution and reports, but they actively participate in the investigation process for the Human Rights Convention that they themselves joined. And they also accept the final opinion from these agencies. And they also provide information on what kind of progress and reform they have made in order to fulfill those reports. And as for the female right and also for the right of people with disabilities, they have continuously expressed their will and commitments to cooperate with North Korea. And as you know, the UN Special Reporter for People with Disabilities visited the North Korea in 2017. At that time, North Korea claimed that the sanctions are inhumane as it increased the toll on children, pregnant women, and also other vulnerable people, including people with disabilities. And the Professor Dejaroto, she gave us a very detailed explanations on UNSC sanctions. And North Korea actually claim that the sanctions pose a threat to their efforts for human rights protection. And also they continuously express their concerns over these UN sanctions. So regarding the impact of sanctions on human rights, yes, this has been explained by various speakers today. And recently, a female organization, they actually came up with a report on how sanctions negatively affect the human rights on the vulnerable groups in North Korea, including women and children. And so to what extent what kind of impacts are made, we have to monitor and assess the situation, but because of the lack of reliable data, we cannot really have the full picture for what really happens in North Korea. And for sanctions against North Korea, the UN charters clarifies that the humanitarian support is not subject to sanctions. However, since 2013, a lot of agencies that provide the humanitarian support to North Korea, they actually suffer a lot. They have suffered a lot since 2013, since the imposition of sanctions. And North Korea recently formed a committee to investigate the damage that they suffer due to sanctions, and they continuously claim that their human rights are violated because of the sanctions, and situation got worse. And the Meshi Pokarel, he talked about the need for monitoring and the need to have reliable data from North Korea. So in order to assess the actual impact of sanctions on North Korea's situation, I think this is something that requires our constant effort. And there is a strategic framework for cooperation between UN and the government of DPRK. And that strategic framework is valid from 2017 to 2021. And they all talk about the human rights-based approach. And recently, North Korea conducted the voluntary national review with regards to SDG. And this document was translated into Korean. And if you look at the North Korea's VNR report for SDG, and a lot of efforts are underway to utilize and analyze this VNR to open a gate for cooperation with North Korea. And also North Korea is pre-active for voluntary national review for SDG and UPR recommendation. And therefore, I think that we have to redouble our efforts to further analyze these reports to find out some insight that can help us enhancing cooperation with North Korea. Because agencies in relation was involved in the VNR for SDG, they don't really look at the UPR reports, and therefore we have to make efforts to interlink these two different fields. And reading the North Korea's VNR report, as somebody mentioned, I was reminded of the importance of SDG number 16 and what kind of plans or targets North Korea has established to accomplish this goal. I read that carefully about this, and the UPR recommendation is not actually included in the SDG VNR. So I think we have to come up with more active policy recommendations. And also depending on the expressions or the terms that we use, North Korea, even for the same recommendation, North Korea sometimes accepts and sometimes refuse. And also depending on what countries make the recommendation, North Korea actually takes different stance and different position. And this is something that we also have to pay heed to. And for the humanitarian issue between the two Koreas, especially the abductees, separate families, and the war prisoners, I think that these are very critical issues that must be addressed. So the UN Seoul office back in 2016 came up with the report titled Torn Apart that views the separate family issues as the issues of human rights, and they try to include the North Korean refugees to the category of separate families. And during the third UPR, the South Korean government made a recommendation regarding separate families, and North Korea accepted that. But then yesterday, the KGFP organized a different forum, and during the forum, we invited the Professor Vitit Muntabun, who served as a special reporter of the North Korean human rights, and he emphasized the need to provide the reunion opportunities for separate families through the remote video and through the internet. And North Korean human rights law stipulates that the state has to work hard to establish peace on the Korean Peninsula and to pursue inter-Korean relations, along with improving human rights in North Korea. So yes, as mentioned by Professor Kang, it is clear that North Korea has maintained the discriminatory system and control. However, in addressing these issues, we should not simply raise concerns in the format of naming and shaming. Rather, we have to come up with the recommendations to encourage North Korea to change their policies. And also the policy recommendation North Korea has already accepted from UPR, we have to closely monitor whether these stances are maintained, whether North Korea keeps respecting these recommendations. And also we have to create an environment conducive for North Korea to fulfill these obligations. So I think that this is the duty of the international community. So I hope that the international community and North Korea can continue to engage in constant cooperation to improve human rights conditions in North Korea. And for this, we have to create an environment, right environment. Last but not least, UPR does have the voluntary trust fund mechanism, and I think we can tap in this mechanism to induce North Korea to accept the recommendations and also implement these recommendations, and also help North Korea set up the targets for SDG and encourage North Korea to respect the core values of SDG. And these also should be properly reflected in North Korea's national development plan. So I think this is something that we have to continuously work on. And I completely agree with what presenters talked about. But listening to Professor Kang's presentation, you see, I have been engaged in investigating human rights situation in North Korea for about 20 years, mainly through the voices of North Korean refugees, through their testimonies. And oftentimes, whenever we come up with the new white paper, we are asked by the question that what kind of progress has been made in North Korea for human rights situation. And the Professor Kang said that when it comes to the food crisis, there is no improvement. And I understand your intention, but fundamentally speaking, yes, we cannot say that there has been the fundamental changes for human rights conditions as well as for like food issues. Like public distribution system is malfunctioning in North Korea. So these fundamental problems still exist. And I don't think that we can restore the public distribution system to the normal level, because already too many North Korean people, they have their own ways of survival. They no longer rely on PDS. But still, I think that there are some slight changes in North Korea, and we have to take them into full consideration. And by doing so, the international community can engage in efforts to improve human rights conditions in North Korea. And especially, we have to understand the position of North Korean state as well as North Korean citizens. And we have to encourage them to improve and work on to improve the human rights conditions there. And for this, again, we have to create a conducive environment. And regarding the right to development, I heard a very detailed explanation, and I sincerely hope that this kind of discussion paper can be shared by agencies that work to improve human rights conditions in North Korea. And I believe that in the sense, we have to organize various kinds of efforts to share this discussion paper. And for this, maybe the UN OHCHR and the Korea Institute for National Unification can cooperate to organize some forums or any kind of gatherings. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for those thoughts. And I think what's come out in your analysis is the need for engagement and communication with the DPRK in order for them to fulfill their own obligations to engage with the international community, to help facilitate their obligations to fulfill the right to food, particularly when they're unable to fulfill their core obligations in relation to the right to food. There is an obligation to engage with the international community to provide assistance to fulfill that right, but then also talking about the context of the international environment within which they operate and how that environment needs to be conducive to one in which the DPRK is willing to engage in conversation and dialogue, and eventually to have a return of the United Nations international community presence within the country, and how that would serve the agenda of also having information exchange that is also essential for other aspects, such as possible sanctions relief, whereby the sanctions committee needs information from the ground in DPRK so that they can assess the human rights, humanitarian impact of the sanctions that are being imposed, and then tailor them accordingly. So it seems that's the message that comes from consideration of the right to development is the need for this engagement to happen, these dialogues to happen, and then for that dialogue and cooperation to result in collaboration, which includes having the United Nations return to the country and engaging in not only humanitarian assistance, but possibly capacity development as well, to enable the state to become more resilient and to be more able to fulfill its own obligations as the primary duty bearer in relation to the right to development, which includes the right to food. I'm afraid that we've run out of time, so no time for question and answers, which I'm quite sorry about. It's quite difficult to moderate the discussion when people are scattered around, but I think it was worthwhile listening to all of those presentations, which were very thought-provoking. So I'd like to thank all of the participants, particularly those away in the US at early hour in the morning, for taking the time to join. And I hope that we can continue this discussion elsewhere. Thank you very much.